out to Montclair.
Absolutely. It's great to be here. It's nice to see everybody. Thank you for coming.
I was so excited when I got a copy of your book because, as many of these folks know, Amanti Vino is solely focused on artisanal, handmade, craft wines, beers, and spirits, and your book is absolutely speaking our language. I would love for you to talk about what inspired you to write this book.
Yeah, so apparently what inspired me to write is I wanted to write a 7-pound book. I wanted to talk about a couple of things. I've been at food and wine for a long time, since 2005 actually, so really long time. And I've been approached about doing books before, but I didn't have one that I really desperately wanted to do. And generally, if you don't desperately want to do a book, don't do it, because it's a ton of work. And what had happened was I got interested in two things. One was this kind of growing wave of winemakers, wineries, vineyards, whatever term you want to use, who are working in ways that seem to benefit the planet rather than cause more destruction. So sustainability, organics, biodynamics, regenerative farming, all that kind of constellation of stuff. And it seemed to me, one, it was a kind of growing movement, not just in California, say, but around the wine world as a whole. And there was more and more interest I was finding particularly from people like were readers of food and wine, or people I meet at events, just in the way that, wine trends kind of follow food trends by several years. Wine's slower than food. There's been a lot of interest in terms of food, in terms of organic produce, in terms of what am I putting in my body and what is it doing to the earth, and that's started to be present in wine in the same way. And then the other thing was that I really wanted to make this division. There have been a lot of sort of internal strife in the wine world between what's called quote-unquote natural wines, which is kind of as little intervention as possible, nothing added, nothing removed, and everything else. And yet there were all these winemakers that I thought were wonderful who were very non-interventionist and very, didn't load their grapes with chemical fertilizers, that didn't do a lot of kind of enzymatic additions to fermentations and all this kind of stuff, but somehow didn't qualify as natural, what seemed to be crazy. When the real division is, to me, between wines that are basically just kind of mass-produced beverage products. The analogy I use in the book is Taco Bell tacos. And it's,
I love that.
And I love. It's a good analogy. Also, I really actually like Taco Bell tacos, but I'm cognizant that the person behind the little hatch who's handing me the Taco Bell taco in the drive-thru did not source the meat themselves from some organic farm somewhere. They didn't cook it carefully. They didn't make the masa for the tortillas and roll it up themselves. And because you can't do that if you're making 1 billion tacos a year. And a lot of wine is done kind of that way. It's made in 150,000, 200,000 gallon tanks. It's from grapes that are farmed effectively, sort of chemical industrial farming, lots of chemical fertilizers, lots of chemical pesticides, and it's essentially made to fit a marketing plan. And it's not to say those wines taste bad. They all taste fine, kind of like Taco Bell tacos taste pretty good. I don't know if anybody read, there was a wonderful New Yorker article a little while back where they talked about basically the design lab, or the taste design lab for Taco Bell. And they do things like they measure the crunch of the shell down to micro pounds per square inch to find the perfect crunch that's most appealing to humans. So that's not the realm of wine I'm interested in, where it's been measured and assigned to a kind of marketing category. I really wanted to write a book about individual vintners, individual winemakers who make something out of a passion for what they're doing and do it in such a way that it expresses the place it's from. And that's usually people who are living on the land. It's sort of wine as an agricultural product rather than wine as an industrial product. And I wanted to get their stories on paper. I wanted to, that was the impetus for the book, was there are all these wonderful winemakers out there who are making these delicious wines that also speak of kind of personal passion and speak of the place they're from, and don't have to cost a fortune, and but are categorically somewhat different from the not to yellowtail too much, but like the yellowtail Shiraz that's on the shelf for $7.99 that came from an ocean of vines somewhere in the Australian Riverland. And so that was, it kind of felt like those two things, the approach to farming that was kind of beneficial to the planet, and these wines that were the wines that got me into wine, made me passionate about wine, were all kind of dovetailing. And it seemed, admittedly 3.5 years ago when I started working on it, like it was the right time. The nature of books being that it seems like the right time, and then you work on it for 3.5 years, and you hope it's still the right time.
It's definitely the right time. One of the things that I talk about in wine classes and on the floor in the store all the time is the difference between organic, biodynamic, regenerative farming, what is sustainable, and what are natural wines.
Right.
And your book does such a brilliant job of explaining those in very, very clear ways, and really excellent. It was really well done, but I thought maybe you could take a minute and just explain the differences, because I think that's really helpful.
Absolutely. And it's one of the reasons I wanted to explain it, and I wanted to explain it clearly, is that wine is pretty opaque about this stuff. One, unlike food, is not regulated by the FDA. It's regulated by this ETB, which used to be the BATF, which is the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. So that's different from the folks regulating food. They lost the firearm part at some point. Apparently they don't regulate firearms anymore anyway, so it's just alcohol and tobacco now. But it's odd because you don't have, like with wine, you turn the bottle around, there's no listed ingredients, there's no product labeling in that way.
There will be in France.
There will be starting in France, yes. I know it's quite controversial in some ways. The short version is that there are basic certifications for how you grow grapes. There are certain sustainability programs, organic programs, but it's all pretty unclear to people, and I want to just make it quite clear and to nutshell it very quickly. Sustainability is, it comes from sustain, to keep something going. It involves, one, being sustainable in an environmental context, two, being sustainable in a sort of social context, so not treating your workers like badly. Three, you actually have to be economically sustainable. If you fail to be economically sustainable, then all the other sustainability is a moot point, because you've gone out of business and your winery or vineyards were turned into condos and it's too late. And so sustainability looks at the farm or the vineyard, but it also looks out into the sort of larger world and to the ecology of the world. Organics is effectively a farming practice that is treating problems on a farm, whether it's a vineyard or whatever, with non-systemic chemicals, rather than say Roundup, which is glyphosate, which is a systemic chemical. It's drawn up through the roots of the vines and goes out and kind of solves whatever problems you need it to solve. Roundup actually is mostly used to get rid of weeds, but you get the idea. And these systemic chemicals tend to also infiltrate the water table. They tend to be present for a long time. The kind of, I guess, the extreme end of systemic chemicals is like defoliants, like Agent Orange or something, which we don't use in farming, even in the worst case scenarios. But that's organics, is using things, naturally occurring compounds to deal with problems in the vineyard, or using often some things like, pheromonal things to take care of bugs that are not, so you're not just zapping them with pesticides. Biodynamics is, anybody know biodynamics here? No, a couple of people. So biodynamics is interesting. That's just one way it started out. Biodynamics is a form of organic farming that was started by, or theorized by a guy named Rudolf Steiner, who is a philosopher, somewhere on the line between philosopher and oddball, in Austria, kind of around the 19-teens. He had he actually had a couple of brilliant ideas. One, he also founded the whole Waldorf school system, but he had this kind of great concept, which is looking at the farm, and he wasn't necessarily talking about vines specifically, but the vineyards have been one of the places it's been applied quite a lot. looking at the farm as an ecological whole. So it's not vines growing in the ground, it's the vines, it's the ground, it's the microbiological life in the ground, it's the birds, bees, it's the sun coming in. All of those things are kind of woven together in a web, in an interactive way. And so when you work biodynamically, you're trying to do things like strengthen the kind of whole life of the plot of land, the vineyard, and everything in it. And which makes a ton of sense. It's great. There are some, because he was a theosophist, which is a very odd little side section of philosophy, there are some very odd aspects to biodynamics. The less odd, for instance, is that you work by the moon cycles, which is pretty traditional in farming. You work with what are called preparations that are more or less homeopathic. You take, for instance, cow horns, you fill them with manure, you bury them in the fall, you unearth them in the spring, and you take the manure, and it's interesting because this preparation 500, which is what it is, when you unearth them in the spring and you smell this manure, it doesn't smell like cow crap anymore. It smells like really just rich, super rich earth, and you kind of disperse that in water and spray it homeopathically over the vineyard, and in theory it kind of increases the microbiological life of the vineyard. He also believed that the reason you put it in cow horns is because cow horns are pointed, and the point of the cow horn focuses the astral energies coming in to affect the manure, which is where biodynamics starts to get a little bit. Thank you, Rudolph. That's interesting, but you're an odd dude. So what I love about biodynamics, you can look at it one way, which is that whatever it does, it makes you pay incredibly close attention to the farming you're doing in the vineyard. The best quote, one of the best, actually I have a bunch of quotes about biodynamics. One of the best is from a wine grower named Olivier Zinobrecht, who is in Alsace, France. And he's a master of wine, which is an incredibly hard, I'm causing myself to, here, what do we do with this? There. Is that better? Okay.
Sorry to interrupt.
I do move my hands a lot when I talk, and it occasionally plays havoc with microphones. So Olivier is a master of wine, which is an incredibly rigorous program of study for wine. He has a master's in enology, he has a master's in viticulture. He's a science guy. He switched to biodynamics quite a while back, and among the things he did when he was figuring out what he wanted to do was he made separate compost piles, one sort of traditional, one using only organic ingredients and one using entirely biodynamic ingredients. And he measured the bacterial and micro life in the soil for each of them, and the biodynamic one was just off the charts. And what he said to me was that, I look at this scientifically, if I can measure the difference, that's enough for me. I don't necessarily have to be able to explain exactly why it's there. And part of the nature of science is trying to figure out why things are there that we don't understand. But he did a lot of tests and kind of came to this conclusion that he didn't know why biodynamics was working the way it was, but it was working, and it was making his vines far healthier and far more, and he thought the quality of the wines was up too. So that's a kind of a way of looking at biodynamics that ignores a little bit of the woo-woo, as it were. Regenerative farming has been referred to as biodynamics without the woo-woo. So, regenerative farming is kind of a combo platter of some of the biodynamic practices and some of sustainability, in that it's all organic. It tends to promote cover crops as much as possible, again with an eye to creating life in the soil. But it also involves aspects of sustainability, like how you treat your workers, how you treat your farm animals, a huge amount about carbon sequestration and trying to lower the carbon footprint of things. And so that is regenerative farming, which is kind of the most recent of these and the most recent to have a certification program attached to it. But that's a quick run through of the organics. And the natural wine is effectively it's more about the winemaking side, and it's using as little human intervention as possible. It's a little tricky because nature does not make wine. nature makes grapes fall on the ground that they get eaten by birds and pooped out somewhere and propagates vines. That's nature's job, is to make more vines. The grapes are a vehicle for making more vines because they have seeds in them. So all wine involves some kind of human intervention. If you don't intervene, there's no wine. But it's kind of an answer to the corporatization of winemaking, the kind of mass production strategies. It's also a little bit of a club. It's like a hipster club. The natural winemaking world is far more tattooed and pierced than the average winemaking world. And you're more apt to find a natural wine bar in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, than you are in, let's say, Montclair, maybe. So there's a little bit of hipster coolness to natural wine, and that's the aspect of it that it reminds me of the indie music scene in the 90s. It's like, if you are too successful, then you're no longer cool and you don't get to be part of the club. So that kind of aspect of it bugged me, and I wanted to break down that wall and mostly talk about people who just weren't in the sort of large-scale industrial corporate-owned side of wine. I hope that wasn't as brief as I had planned it to be, but I think it was relatively clear.
No, very clear, and it's complicated, right? Because technically, everyone that you write about in your book is a natural winemaker. They let ambient yeast bring on a natural fermentation and all of those things. But
and yet some of them aren't considered to be part of the natural winemaker club.
Right.
Because there is this little social aspect to it.
And then the other piece that I thought was really interesting is the whole organic piece, which is, I'm all for organic farming, of course, but if you grow grapes in a place where there's a ton of rainfall and you have to spray copious amounts of copper sulfate, that's not so good either.
There's caveats to basically life. There are caveats to everything. There are very few firm rules, except we start out at one point and then we end at one point as humans, and none of us lives forever. That's kind of it, death and taxes. But it is tricky. Like if you look at Italy, Sicily has actually one of the highest percentages of organic grape growing in the entire country. Well, one reason for that is that it's fairly dry, it's warm, and it's really easy to grow grapes without a lot of mildew pressure, without a lot of pest pressures, and so it's much easier to be organic in Sicily than it is in Piedmont, where the grape that is the main grape of Piedmont is called Nebbiolo, which is from nebula, which is fog, because there's fog all the time, and one thing fog is wet, and one thing wet does is make your grapes rot. And the way you prevent grapes from rotting is you spray it with stuff. And so there's a lot of playoffs back and forth, but generally speaking, if you can avoid using a lot of industrial chemicals, I think that's better. It's a short version of it.
Okay, so I've dedicated my life to traveling and getting to as many wine regions as I possibly can. And as I was reading through your book, even though I just got back from 3 weeks in France and Italy, I was like ready to jump on a plane. So if you were to say, okay, your next 3 wine and food trips, where should people go, and what producers should they?
Yeah, it's really tough because there's a lot of,
great ones.
I have this job that involves traveling to wine regions, which is really pleasant because wine regions are generally speaking beautiful and fun. It's not like traveling to I don't know, the desert. But the desert's nice too, actually. The desert in the West is good. But that's a tough one. I mean, Piedmont, which I just mentioned, which is the home of Barolo and Barbaresco, is also the home of white truffles. And so it's got gorgeous wines. It's got gorgeous sort of classic Italian hill towns that are misty in the morning and the mist blows off. It's got truffles, which are great, and it's got just really good food, period, and it's not that far from Milan. So it kind of hits any number of really excellent things in terms of travel.
And a bunch of the producers that you mentioned, like Bartolo Mascarello and Francesco Rinaldi, will take visitors.
It will take visitors. The general rule for Europe as opposed to the US, if you're going to Sonoma or Napa, actually more now than you used to, but generally you can show up and taste wine. Europe, you typically have to make a reservation in advance, and it's often just because for small producers, they don't have a tasting room staff. Like, the person who's going to taste the wine with you is the winemaker, who may also be the owner, or the winemaker and the owner's spouse, or their kid who's been dragged into doing this on weekends. And so they need to know in advance that people are coming. But it's funny, I mean, Piedmont is a classic wine region, some of the greatest red wines on the planet. But one of the best wine trips I've ever taken was to Georgia, country of, not state of. State of Georgia's wine's not so good, sorry. Any Georgians out there, I apologize. It's too hot, too wet. Muscadine, which is the grape that's often used, is not such a good grape. Georgia, the country of, is basically the origin point for winemaking. The oldest archaeological evidence of winemaking is a site outside Tbilisi called Gadikirli Gorja, I think. I've been there. Like most archaeological sites, it largely looks like a pit. But it's still pretty cool as a wine writer to stand on the edge of this and think, 8,000 years ago, some Neolithic Georgian farmer was putting grapes into an urn to make wine, and that's the earliest evidence we have of it. Georgia is an incredibly complicated country, and that it was part of the USSR for many years. It was behind the Iron Curtain. It's been overrun by everybody at one point or another. It's in that zone of being somewhat Eastern Europe, somewhat Middle East, somewhat Asia, somewhat Europe. It's a saddle more or less between the Caucasus and whichever is on the other side. It's gorgeous. The food is extraordinary. It's had a really complicated history. The people are wonderful. There's a long tradition of big dinners with tons of toasting and friendliness to outsiders, despite the fact that the outsiders didn't overrun the country. And it's kind of a magical place that's definitely not. It doesn't feel like you're in the current era. And so it's not the easiest place to visit, because one, you fly to Istanbul and you fly for another 7 hours to Georgia. So there's that. And people don't speak English. I mean, it's Georgian, and the language isn't the same either. So street signs are like, okay, I guess I'm here, maybe. Who knows? But if you find someone local to guide you, I thought it was a magical place. And then the other thing is that, and I didn't get into this in the book too much, but there's wine made in New Jersey. There's actually some quite reasonably good wine made in New Jersey. There's wines made in almost every state. We're in every state, we're only a place in Kansas, but in business. So. But there's a lot. You don't have to travel that far to visit a winery, and the winemaking is the same everywhere you go. So there's always some learning that's involved. It can be a lot of fun. New York State, the Finger Lakes make some of the best Riesling on the planet. They also make some terrible Chardonnay, but they make some of the best Riesling on the planet. And you can't just get in your car and travel to wine regions. It's not, you don't have to live in California to do that.
That is true.
Yeah.
That's true. Lopez de Heredia, you talked about in the book. So Lopez de Heredia has long been my desert island winery. Like, I am stranded on an island, I can drink nothing but one producer for the rest of my life. Lopez is definitely in contention. And we visited in 2017. My family got, fortunately, for a short period of time, locked in the basement in the cellar with the lights off. I had a corkscrew, I was not too worried. My kids were a little bit worried, but if you want to talk about your visit there.
Yeah, so Lopez de Heredia is a winery in Rioja in Spain. It's old, it's been around since the late 1800s. It's very unusual in that they really haven't changed much since the 1800s. They do things the way they've always done things. And one of the aspects of that, of course, is they were effectively organic, because that's what you did in the 1800s, because you didn't have all the industrial sort of fertilizer stuff. And the sort of industrial farming comes out of the chemical industry during World War II. So, all that kind of what was oddly called the Green Revolution, which was in the 60s, and was about kind of increasing crop production through chemicals, is a carryover from research that was done during World War II for a variety of things that were probably less good for us. But going back to Lopez de Heredia, it's like stepping into the past in that, some of the way I was describing Georgia, the building is beautiful. But the cellars are just kind of covered in dark mold and cobwebs and full of barrels of old wine. And Maria Jose and her sister Mercedes, who run it, so it's run by two women now. Their great-grandfather started it. Are both remarkable people, tremendously talented, tremendously tough, because it's very, when they started, I mean, Maria Jose is probably mid-50s, when she started running the winery in Spain at that time, women didn't run wineries. That was not, like, the basic deal was you gave the winery to your son, and if there was no son, you sold the winery. And she was like, the hell with that, I'm going to run the winery, Dad. And she and her sister had, she's the kind of head of the winery, her sister's the winemaker. But the wines are, they kind of speak to the past in a way that, you know, they don't taste like modern wines, but they're delicious and they're wonderful, and they stick to this old Rioja habit that nobody does anymore of holding their wines for years before they're released. So rather than having to sell the wine yourself, they don't sell their wine until like 10 years after the vintage. And so when it's sort of pre-aged for you. And it's just kind of a magical place with really wonderful wines, and very unlike any that are made, and very uncompromising, I think is part of what I liked about it. And so so the way the book is structured, there's about 60 pages at the beginning about why this book and who I'm writing about and what organics and biodynamics and all this are. And then there's 260 odd profiles of wineries, and it's all, I talk to everybody who's in the book. I've been to most wineries. I will say the pandemics are not good for travel. So there are some that were Zoom calls that I didn't anticipate being Zoom calls. But pandemics actually are good for writing books, though, because you sit in your apartment with nowhere to go and nothing to do except work on your giant 700-page book. So their profiles are a lot of interview material. I wanted to really get people in their own words. It's almost like 260 short stories in a sense. It's not super technical. It's not meant to be super technical. It's really people's stories about why they work the way they do and why they are in the place they are and what that place is and why it makes the wines it does. And so some are shorter, some are longer, but it's a lot of individual stories or stories of families because some of the filters for the book, there's no corporate-owned wineries in the book with the exception of two, one of which is Ridge Vineyards in California, which is so significant I couldn't leave them out. And their ownership, they're actually owned by a Japanese company, which is the most, I talked to the head of Ridge, he's like, yeah, we basically send them 2 cases of wine a year and they never say anything. So that to me qualified as fairly hands-off, you know. And then the second one is a wonderful winery in California called Massican that was owned by Dan Petrosky, who's a fascinating winemaker and a brilliant character. However, he was doing everything himself, and he just like burned out. He sold, and he's still with the winery. He's got a contract to be there for the next 6 years. But he sold between when I turned in the book and when the book was published. I was like, damn, you could have like either sold 6 months earlier or maybe a year later. But did you have to sell like 2 months before the book came out? But whatever, his wines are still great. Also, almost all the wines in the book are under $100 or under $120 because I didn't want to write about wines that people couldn't afford. And I also didn't want to write about, there's some of the great wines of the world like Domaine Romanée-Conti. Yes, they farm organically. Yes, they're certainly independently owned. The wines are brilliant expressions of where they're from. They fit every aspect of what I'm writing about. However, the cheapest wine for Domaine Romanée-Conti is about $2,500 a bottle. And there's been hundreds of pages written about them over time, probably thousands. And it's like, why? I mean, nobody needs me to tell them about Domaine Romanée-Conti. They need me to tell them about like someone like Julien Cession, who odds are no one in here has heard of. There's a young guy in the Rhone Valley who makes just brilliant, Saint-Joseph and brilliant white Rhones from various places, and isn't Domaine Romanée-Conti. His wines are $40 a bottle, and they're spectacular. So that was more of the kind of people I wanted to write about. The viable and ideally the findable, though. The nature of small wineries is always a little tricky.
We have a lot of overlap.
You find them right there. That's yeah. So you guys are lucky. You've got a local, the local local store that actually concentrates on these wines.
With global warming becoming more and more of an issue, did you have some really interesting conversations with winemakers about changes that they're making in the vineyard to combat?
Yeah, I've talked, that's a subtext throughout a lot of the interviews that I did. It's affecting everybody in the wine business in one way or another. Partly because it's made harvest dates creep up earlier and earlier because of warming trends, but more because it's made weather much more unpredictable in a lot of places, and so you get incidences like, for instance, forest fires in California and in Oregon, but you get also stuff like the Loire Valley where it used to be they had spring frost and then they had what's called bud break, which is when the first little what will become grape clusters appear. But because of warmer winters, they now get bud break, but they're still getting spring frost at the same time. The problem with the spring frost after you get bud break is that it kills all the little buds. It's just like blowtorches with frost. And then you lose 40% of your crop. And if you are a small producer and that happens multiple years, you are out of business. And so there's been huge problems like that that aren't as visible as places burning up, but are still, and just off-season hail, and hail, like big hail. Like, I remember talking to I went to visit a Beaujolais producer at one point, and we walked out to go visit the vineyards, and I looked at his car, and it looked like someone had taken a ball-peen hammer and just beaten his car all over. It was just covered in little circular dents. I'm like, what the hell happened to your car? He's like, hail, golf ball size hail. And golf ball size hail is not good for vines or for grape clusters. But so there was a lot of problems, and then there's a lot of people trying to figure out what to do about the problems. So for instance, in Germany, I talked to one winemaker, Philippe Wittmann, and he's basically planting, most German vineyards are on a slope like this. They're kind of always been right in here, but he's planting it higher and higher up the slope because it gets cooler as you go higher up the slope. And so it's a kind of natural way to kind of work against this, warming trends. There are some places that have benefited from this. England is not in the book, but there actually is English sparkling wine right now that's quite good. 50 years ago, you couldn't get Chardonnay and Pinot ripe enough to make palatable sparkling wine in England, and it was wine is very grape growing for wine is very precision, and so just like 1 or 2 degrees difference, and they've been able to make quite good sparkling wine. Champagne is champagne the way it is, partly because champagne is, in the past, was as cold a place as you could get and still make some kind of wine. And the way you make palatable wine in champagne is you make it with bubbles and usually a little tiny addition of dosage of grape sugar. The sweetness counteracts the acidity. What's weird, you talk to champagne makers right now, and they're like, global warming, it's actually been okay for us. they're like, don't tell anybody, because it used to be 3 out of 10 years you got garbage grapes in champagne because it was too cold, and now they're kind of like pretty okay. But that, on a global sense, that's still not a good thing. That's nice for the champagne laws, it's not so good for the rest of us.
Very true. I heard the same in Piedmont. A couple of producers said, there were vintages where we just didn't get full ripeness, and now we're not so worried about that.
Yeah, in Piedmont, typically harvesting Nebbiolo for Barolo, you would harvest in mid to late October, which meant you were right up against when it would then start to pour rain and be cold. And if it wasn't ripe enough by October 20th, your chances of getting your crop just completely rained out were huge. Now they're harvesting September 20th, and the rains are still late in the game. So it has been oddly conducive to more consistent vintages in Piedmont.
Okay, changing gears a little bit. There's been increasing dialogue, and we were talking about this before as well in the United States, about the dangers of consuming any alcohol at all. And my point is that there's absolutely no differentiation between those mass-produced, kind of soulless, to use your word, wines and these boutique artisanal wines that are made the same way that they've been made for many, many generations. I thought it would be interesting to hear you talk about that.
I mean, too much alcohol is bad. Pretty clear, and that is, no one sane would argue against that. There is kind of a neo-prohibitionist movement going on with it's kind of implying that all alcohol will kill you. It's more or less the version, the version of it. Or increase your risk of cancer, increase your risk of your head falling off. I don't know what. I think wine is somewhat different from things we drink just to get wasted on. The vodka is largely just alcohol. Wine has a social context and a social utility that is different, and that we typically don't sit around and just drink a bunch of wine alone to get buzzed. Usually, a bottle of wine is designed to be drunk by more than one person. You drink it with friends. It is doesn't have to be, but it goes great as part of a meal. Very few people do vodka shots as part of a meal. The question of health benefits, there's the old, whatever it was, the 80s, when 60 Minutes did this thing about, the red wine paradox and how, red wine was good for you. Now there's kind of a backlash against that. There's antioxidant compounds in red wines like resveratrol that in theory seem to be good for the system. Short version is, to me, alcohol in moderation seems fine. Alcohol in extremis, not so good. Life itself will kill you. Life without joy, you're already dead. So why live without joy? And I think that we tend to like an absolutist approach to things. It's like, all alcohol is going to kill you. Well, it's like, I'm reminded of, at some point they did some test, this may be possible, I remember reading it, and I think it was sometimes that, someone had done a study that too much saliva will actually cause cancer. And they're like, well, what the hell am I supposed to do here? Cheese is probably bad for you. Preserved meats, God knows they're terrible for you. Wagon meat's terrible for you. It's. However, I know we're running out of time, but I will say there's a wonderful winemaker, Giuseppe Vaira, in the book, and Vaira Winery, his father started it, and Giuseppe was planning to be a surgeon, and he was thinking about going back to school and said to his father, and I'm going to paraphrase, but basically he's like, surgeons save life. What's the social utility of making wine? And his father said, well, if you want to save lives, be the surgeon. But art, poetry, wine, there's no social utility in that kind of sense. But what's the point of living if you don't have those things? And that to me was a good kind of, and not a bad way to end.
I'm so sorry, sir. I'm from Turkey. So I think you have been in Turkey.
I've been through Turkey, but I have not spent enough time in Turkey. Because there's wine in Turkey too.
What do you think about Turkish wine?
I think there's
and Turkish record. This it is a special alcoholic drink.
Yes.
Raki.
Yeah.
R-A-K-I.
Yes, it's
So my hometown is used to be official government factory, but they closed it 2 decades ago. So at that time it was a very organic factory, but now it's not.
It's not.
I need your opinion. So.
Yeah. So Turkish wine, Turkey, like Georgia, is one of the source points of winemaking in the world. It's one of some of the oldest winemaking evidence, archaeological evidence is in Turkey. That's where it all starts. There's not a lot of Turkish wine in the U.S., though there is some imported. It can be wonderful, but you really have to more or less go to Turkey and try all the Turkish wine. Sadly, I haven't been beyond Istanbul, so I need to go, visit vineyards at some point. And then in the terms of, I'm less familiar with the distilled products, the Rocky, but I have friends who like it a lot. not. It's a little more potent.
You can find family factories
Yeah.
in European part of Turkey and in Anatolian part of the Turkey
Right.
as well, if you have a chance to visit
Yeah.
at the time.
But it's yeah, it's a.
You are invited. You are. I'm a visitor over here, and I'm an amateur researcher. So you are invited to visit my country
Thank you so
again.
much. I would like to go back. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I've been going to Sharon's store since she opened, so it's wonderful to have that resource. And I will just say that one of my favorite Cabernets is from Turkey, and you can buy it in the duty-free store at the airport. So it's
Super.
maybe a large producer. I have two questions. One is that you mentioned the very old cave in Rioja. We were at Bodega Lecea, L-E-C-E-A, and it was remarkably similar. I didn't hear the name of what you said.
Lopez de Heredia.
Lopez.
Lopez de Heredia.
And the other is, if you were to pick another region in the world that's kind of under the radar aside from Georgia, what would that be?
I would pick. That's an interesting question. I really love Galicia in Spain, which is, is the western coast of Spain, and because it's got basically a wall of mountains blocking it off, it's not what you can think of Spain as being like flat and hot and flamenco and all that, and Galicia is green and verdant and some of the best seafood on the planet and really wonderful white wines and some very good red wines that people know less about, and it's a different side of Spain, and so people forget to visit it, I think. Plus the cathedral at Santiago de Compostela is quite remarkable, so I guess I'd throw that out there. And I would also say it is Indie Bookstore Day. Without indie bookstores and without independent wine stores, both these worlds fall apart. And so while it's convenient to buy, I actually can't remember the Jersey laws where you can buy wine at a grocery store or not, but I do think that if you're interested in wine, the single best thing you can do for yourself is find a good independent wine store with a staff who will listen to you and find out what you're interested in, what you like, and talk to you and offer interesting things to you. And it's a curatorial thing, much like a good bookstore. That there's advice to be had, and it's one of the best ways to learn about wine. It's how I started learning. I didn't grow up in wine at all, and I got kind of interested in it, and I got very lucky to kind of connect with a wonderful wine store in Palo Alto when I was there, watching close to Palo Alto, and they were just incredibly helpful, and I learned a lot simply by talking to them. So, pro indie.
Thank you.
Yeah. Question? Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you for your very enthusiastic, informative talk.
Thanks.
I like to learn something new every day, and today certainly learned a lot of new things. And my question is sort of an odd one. What is your opinion of Drop of God?
Oh, Drops of God. Yeah. So, has anybody seen, other than you, seen Drops of God?
Yeah.
Yeah. So Drops of God is it was a TV series. However, it started as a Japanese manga, an illustrated book, and was enormously popular in Japan. It actually led to like several different Drops of God editions and stories. But it's a story about wine in the context of kind of a somewhat mysterious wine critic who passes away, and then his collection is going to be given away to either his estranged daughter or his primary assistant, let's say, without giving away anything in the show. I went into that show thinking, oh God, another wine show that they're going to screw things up and it's going to be stupid. And I came out of it thinking, that was a terrific show. And it's, and it's on, I think it's on Apple Plus, right? But it's very high budget. It's set in France and in Japan primarily, and it's really wonderful. I really enjoyed it. Yeah. So if anybody hasn't seen it, which probably most people haven't, it's you don't have to be a wine geek to enjoy this show because it's the personal story of the main characters is so compelling, and the actress so good that she kind of transcends the wine geekiness of it. You have any question right there? Close to you.
I
have a question for each of you. Other than the book, where else can I find out more information? And some vineyards will ship to you. Does any of your information provide like which vineyards, if you wanted to partake in, let's say something in Texas or I don't know, Oregon or whatever, how would you find out? And what events are there if you wanted to, like on a regular basis, get an artisanal wine, you want to try and sample things, what do you provide for your consumer who just wants to just find out what's there and to get started?
Absolutely. So we offer wine tastings at Amanti Vino every Saturday afternoon. They're free. You don't have to sign up. Just come. Sometimes there's a theme. Sometimes it's just, hey, what are we excited about this week? But the tasting bar is always open on Saturday afternoons. That's a great way to learn. The second thing is, exactly as Ray said, come in and talk to me or anyone on my team. We're all super passionate about wine and want to provide as much education as people are interested in receiving. We also do wine pairing dinners, so we take over different restaurants, like we partner with Turtle and the Wolf a lot, and do wine pairing dinners where we'll bring in a winemaker and he or she will present their wines. Sometimes we don't have a winemaker, I just kind of pick wines that I'm excited about. And then the last opportunity is almost every Saturday I have a class in the Amanti Vino classroom upstairs, and they're all listed on my website. So if I'm in the Montclair store, there is a class. Pretty much that's the way it works. But those classes are all listed.
And there's also an Amanti Vino in Morristown.
Thank you, Ariel. Yes.
But I just want to say that I know personally that Sharon did not pay her to ask that question.
And I was,
But it was a good one.
the other thing is also wineries, I actually don't know the Jersey laws about wineries direct shipping. All wineries, they can or can't, they can't. Unfortunately, every state has different laws about wine shipping and not wine shipping. Jersey is one state where they cannot ship direct to you. It all comes out of prohibition. It's just, the US wine laws, liquor laws are completely wacky and strange. However, they can ship to wine stores, and wine stores will help you find, it is absolutely reasonable to find a wine that you think is great somewhere and go into a store like yours and say, I had this amazing wine, do you have it? If you don't have it, can you get it somewhere? Because
I special order bottles for people every single day.
yeah,
I'm always happy to do that.
yeah.
It's
There's a lot about wine wine is somewhat daunting for some reason, and there's a lot of opaque information, but in fact, there's a lot, once you find a avenue, a lot of it just kind of opens up. I say that wine itself wants to be drunk by everybody. It's the wine bottle is happy about anything, anybody of any kind drinking wine. You just have to find the people who will get it to you. And that's exactly what I did when I was first getting into wine, was go to K&L Wines, which is the store in California, and just ask a ton of questions and go to Saturday tastings. I just would show up, they always had like 10 bottles open, you taste a few things, and you learn a lot. It's fun too. It's not like trigonometry, it's really fun.
Okay, so we have 2 more questions.
Okay.
Hi, I'm an architect, and I recently had an opportunity to be a guest critic for a student project where the challenge to the students was for them to envision the future of retail.
Mhm.
And 2 of the students picked wine shops as their topic, to envision what the future, what a wine shop of the future would be like, and what it would feature and how it would operate. So I want to turn that question to both of you and see what your conception would be of, if we were to think about going to a wine shop 25 years from now, what would we experience?
It's an interesting question. I think you'd see a lot of different packaging, certainly lighter weight bottles, and a lot of alternative packaging, because there's a huge conversation right now about the carbon footprint of glass. Wine bottles are heavy, not just the wine in them, but the bottle itself.
We're going to see more boxes and cans,
Yeah.
for sure.
For sure. Ideally, there would be looser, or at least not ridiculous, wine shipping laws. I think the other thing that's happened, and you'll see more of it, the internet has changed how we get information, for sure. And so a lot of stores are still pretty much bottles on a shelf and a person behind a counter, and that's the information conduit. And I think that's gonna change more and more with you know, QR codes and stuff like that. Some wine stores are already there with, you know, where you can like scan the bottle and it'll provide digital information and all that. But you actually run a wine store, so.
We have some iPads that we've been kind of testing and to provide additional information for folks as well. So we're definitely playing around with that. I don't want technology to replace the human experience. And so for me, I want to provide as much technology as people desire, but I don't want any substitute for that interaction. It's funny, I was helping a customer the other day. It was someone I hadn't met before, and I offered to help. And he said, "Oh, I don't need help, I'm just gonna read the cards." And I just thought it was so funny. You know, I have these individually written tasting notes on every wine in the store, but they weren't designed to replace the humans, they were designed to supplement. So, you know, there's always that danger if you introduce too much technology that you lose that human interaction.
But it's also the classic thing about guys not asking for directions. That's true at retail. So, you're like, "Can I help you?" "No, I'm fine." And then they wander around the store for like 10 minutes, and then they come up and say, "Well, actually, I didn't."
But it's interesting, you know, during COVID, we accidentally trained our customers to rely more on email and internet orders and things like that. And once COVID kind of started to lift, it was really challenging to just get people back in, not just to Amanti Vino, but to every retail store. And so I want to encourage people to, you know, get out there and go visit your local bookstore, come to the library, you know, have those human interactions, because there's really no substitute for it.
Okay, one last question here.
Thank you. It was really good to hear you, Ms. Ryle, and
Thank you.
Sharon as well, to kind of interview and hear about wines in general. I just wanted to kind of get a feel of, when you were writing this book, how was it easy enough for you to connect with the winemaker? Was it easy? Were they all accessible, whether they were in Europe or US? Because I've seen a difference. I've been able to go to, like you go to Europe, first of all, I've not paid, I rarely pay more than like $5 or $10. And the winemakers give you all the time, like Mr. Fodi or Trosen in Mosel. I mean, they sit with you for hours and will talk to you about their wines and the vineyards and the wines themselves. But in the US, it seems to be very different. Sonoma Valley that I went to, a couple of wineries that I won't mention their names, but first of all, the tastings are like ridiculously expensive, anywhere from like 85 and upwards.
Yep.
And then they're not accessible. The folks are not, they're not the folks who are actually working in the vineyards. So I just wanted to kind of get a feel from you, how was your experience?
Yeah, so I mean, my experience is realistically a little different because I've been in the wine editor for food wine for 17 years. So I usually get called back, you know, by winemakers. But I do think, I do think Europe and the US are somewhat different in that regard. And it's shifting a little, you're starting to see it shift, at least in big wineries in Europe, a little toward the US model.
Yeah.
Super quickly, what happened in the US in the 70s was people started going to Napa Valley and wine tastings were free. And they would head down Highway 29, they taste at every single winery, and they drink at every single winery, and then they basically run into a tree. And so the wineries actually instituted tasting fees to slow people down, to keep them from going to every single winery one after the other and getting wasted. But they pretty quickly realized that this was actually a great revenue stream. And so Napa kind of started the whole idea of the tasting room where you pay, and where the winery, that's actually a significant source of income for the winery. It was never the case in Europe that was how it worked, and a lot of wineries weren't even open unless you were in the trade. So it still sustains, especially when you're looking at small wineries in Europe. It's usually there's no tasting room, or there's a tiny, like, you know, a little room with a couple of chairs and a table, and you do tend to meet with the primary people, and it's just not structured the same way. I do think that when you go to small wineries in the U.S., like really boutique operations, that are usually not in the usual suspect places like Napa Valley or Healdsburg and Sonoma, then you actually do get to interact with the staff, with the owners more often. But, you know, at Napa at this point, the cost of land, the cost of being a winery in Napa, and the average price per bottle, which is like Napa Valley Cabernet, the average price is $100 a bottle now. It prohibits that kind of casual environment in the same way, which is a pity. I mean, I completely agree. That is why I say, though, if you're traveling in Europe and you want to go to wineries, arrange it in advance, because otherwise you may walk up and knock on the door and there's literally no one there because they went down the street to get a vacuum cleaner or something. So, you know, so there's that, you know.